Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet is often considered the greatest love story of all time. Why this is the case, given that the two protagonists are pig-headed, naive, love-struck teenagers who barely know each other and whose relationship lasts a matter of days, remains a mystery to many. A key theme of the play is that of conflict, principally between the lovers' warring families, the Capulets and the Montagues, but also between the older and younger generations. To what extent should the older generation be able to control the desires and the life pathways of their children is a pertinent question in the play, especially for many Western audiences with strong idealistic notions of romantic love and of the fundamental rights of the individual. Of course, in Shakespeare's time, a father's right to play a key role, if not the key role, in choosing a daughter's husband would have been seen as sacrosanct. This is no longer the case, and this and other changes to society subtly alter both the Romeo and Juliet theatrical experience and the play itself for the modern audience. Thus, directors of modern interpretations of Shakespeare, including films, have decisions to make. Even if they decide to leave Shakespeare's language unchanged, albeit in the vast majority of cases savagely cut, do they try to shoehorn often archaic words and phrases into a modern setting, or do they attempt to faithfully recreate a bygone world 4 centuries removed from our time? There can be problems with either approach. Will modern audiences really be convinced by skinheads armed with guns and surrounded by bikini-clad babes spouting iambic pentameter, as is the case in Baz Luhrmann's 1996 production? Alternatively, rhyming couplets and initially bewildering wordplay may well seem to fit better with faux Elizabethan surroundings, minus the stench. But will this grab the interest of anyone other than desperate high school teachers and unshaven Shakespeare fanatics? Such argument is beyond the scope of this essay, but does perhaps begin to explain the existence of so many more movies inspired by Shakespeare rather than ones that actually use his language. Baz Luhrmann's William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, to give it its full title, wasn't the only film released in 1996 inspired by the greatest love story of all time. Husband and wife writing directing team Joseph Bologna and Renee Taylor unleashed Love Is All There Is in the same year. The film adapts a plot device so beloved of Shakespeare himself, a play within a play, and includes a hilariously amateur production of Romeo and Juliet, with Romeo played by a down-to-earth young Italian-American called Rosario Capomezza, and Juliet, an Italian aristocrat who goes by the name of Gina Malachichi. The Capomezzas and Malachichis are bitter rivals competing for catering business. Whereas the Capomezzas offer their customers hot colours, spicy sauces and jumbo portions, the Malachichis are real blue bloods from Italy who offer a more sophisticated culinary experience of dainty low-fat portions and subtle flavours. The respective parents are horrified to see their children cast together as Romeo and Juliet in a dramatic last-minute casting change due to injury, and continue their family conflict whilst the two teenagers quickly and publicly fall in love with each other. The People vs. Friar Laurence, the man who killed Romeo and Juliet, was first produced in 2004 in Los Angeles, USA. A musical written by Phil Swan and Ron West, it pokes fun at virtually every aspect of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, while still following the original plotline reasonably faithfully, albeit with the addition of Friar Laurence being blamed and tried for the whole debacle. Romantic love is satirised in the fact Romeo and Juliet only get together initially to use each other tonight. The institution of marriage is derided by cynical comments from Lady Capulet and the nurse, including, "Sex, you're right, it won't be fun, but one male heir and then it's done." And even Shakespeare's language, largely sanctified by the academic community, is questioned when Romeo takes one of Juliet's most famous lines and asks, "But why? Wherefore art thou?" instead of just why. So this essay will explore the theme of conflict as presented in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet and these other texts inspired by the bard. Baz Luhrmann's William Shakespeare's Romeo plus Juliet, Bologna Taylor's Love Is All There Is, and Swan West's The People vs. Friar Laurence, the man who killed Romeo and Juliet. The majority of the essay will focus on the theme of family conflict, How does the conflict between the Montagues, Capulets, or, as in Love Is All There Is, the Capamezzas and the Malacicci families manifest itself? What has caused this conflict? How long has it been going on? What are the consequences? With Romeo Montagu and Juliet Capulet, or Rosario Capamezza and Gina Malacicci in Love Is All There Is, falling in love during the course of the text, one consequence is inter-family conflict expanding to inter- and intra-family conflict, as the younger generations stand up to and oppose the older generation's dogmatic prejudices. The tragedy of both Shakespeare's and Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet is that the conflict between the warring families ultimately results in the cruel, unnecessary death of those they love the most. Stay tuned. This is Schofield on Shakespeare. In Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, the Montagu-Capulet conflict is so intense that it extends to servants. The play opens with two Capulet servants, Samson and Gregory, armed with swords and shields, bragging about their sexual prowess and disdain for any from the house of Montagu. Referring to Montagu women, Gregory quips, "They must take it in sense that feel it," only for Samson to retort, "Me they shall feel while I am able to stand, and 'tis known I am a pretty piece of flesh." These witticisms follow on from references to Montagu maidenheads, i.e. virginities, and so Gregory's "they must take it" can be interpreted as the women receiving an erect penis, while Samson continues this laddish theme with the use of the verb stand, which can also mean to have an erection. The pair in many ways are typical testosterone-fueled young men who could be from any century, keen to talk up their sexual ability and desire, and, with no women present, inclined to talk of them principally as sexual objects. However, the existence of the Montagu-Capulet conflict provides them with an obvious target for their misogynistic, idle boasts. Shakespeare's warring families are famously both alike in dignity, both as noble as each other. In Baz Luhrmann's production, the families are competing property magnates, and their employees are as enthusiastically involved in the hatred as Shakespeare's servants. Luhrmann cuts the majority of Gregory and Samson's bawdy wordplay, but the conflict similarly provides young men with a strong identity which can and is expressed aggressively. The film begins with Montagu employees, rather than Capulet servants, driving around in a bright yellow open-top convertible with a personalised Montagu number plate. They hurl abuse about Capulets at passers-by, and when they pull into a petrol station, are keen to emphasise their sexual potency in a more direct way than their Shakespearean equivalents. Whilst one employee heads towards a ladies' college minibus and suggestively licks his nipples, the other imitates the thrusting movements of reasonably aggressive sexual intercourse. They chant, "I am a pretty piece of flesh," and the body language makes it clear that this line is referring to their manhoods, which they hold in evident esteem. Of course, there will always be young men in their late teens or 20s keen to show off sexual prowess, but in the film this desire seems bound up in an aggressive identity as either Montagues or Capulets. As well as the personalised number plate and an opening line of "A dog of the house of Capulet moves me," they are introduced explicitly as the Montagu boys, whilst one of the men even has Montagu tattooed into the back of his bald head. In Luhrmann's vision, the Montagu-Capulet conflict has resulted in very clearly defined group identities, for which the primary means of expression is violent behaviour and sexual aggression. Joseph Bologna and Rennie Taylor's Love Is All There Is likewise chooses to set up the two families as specifically business rivals, but the catering operations are on a much smaller scale than the property companies in Baz Luhrmann's film. The latter shows two neighbouring tower block Capulet Montagu HQs towards the beginning of the movie. Whereas an encounter between the Capulets and Montagus at a petrol station results in a dramatic shootout, fire and death, in Love Is All There Is, there is little more than the exchange of angry words and optimistic threats.
Idiot, you cut me off! We're going to put you out of business, you Sicilian swamp guinea!
Hey, I got the right of way, and you're gonna put your sister's ass out of business, you Florentine mountain wop!
Rosario!
The sexual aggression remains in the reference to the Malachichi employee's sister's arse, but Rosario's crestfallen expression when rebuked by his mother implies that in general he is a far calmer, better-natured young man than the angry thumb-biters in the opening scenes of Shakespeare and Luhrmann. Shakespeare's Romeo is also calmer, of course, induced by his obsession with Rosaline. But crucially, Bologna and Taylor choose not to include other young men from Rosario's family, dizzy with hatred for the Malachichis, and the result is a far more light-hearted, comic conflict and start to the movie. The encounter between Montagu and Capulet servants in Act 1, Scene 1 of Romeo and Juliet results in multiple sword fights and a mass brawl on the streets of Verona. Yet there seems little logic or reason for the animosity held between the two families. When the prince roars onto stage to draw a halt to the fighting, he claims that their brawls have been bred of an airy word, have arisen from a simple, trivial, throwaway comment. Perhaps following 3 civil brawls, the prince has lost all patience and empathy with the two families' disputes and is dismissing it unfairly. Yet Romeo's lack of interest in the most recent fight instalments, later in the same scene, may also signify not just an immature preoccupation with Rosaline, but a moribund acceptance that there is little of genuine substance in his family's disputes with the Capulets. So the conflict may have stemmed from something deemed insignificant by the prince, but it is a long-standing one. The prologue refers to it as an ancient grudge, and Montagu used the same adjective following an informal post-mortem after the prince's rollicking. The apparent pointlessness of the feud is satirised in Swan and West musical, The People vs. Friar Laurence, the man who killed Romeo and Juliet. Listen to both sets of servants as they sing about their ancient conflicts.
Totally forgotten. As drunk and stupid lads, we have finally found our niche. To insult each other's manhood, we call each other bitch. For in this day and age, frailty's womankind. It's a beautiful day in Verona, in the good old summertime.
It is one thing knowing deep inside that your hatred for another family has spiralled disproportionately away from that deserving of an original historic offence, and quite another admitting it openly while singing gustily in unison with your opponents. The effect of this is a comic, light-hearted atmosphere, far removed from the aggression of Shakespeare and Baz Luhrmann, and even the localised bickering in Love Is All There Is. The reference to Shakespeare's Hamlet accentuates the pointlessness of the Capulet-Montagu feud. Young Hamlet has an excellent reason to seek conflict with his uncle, who not only killed his father, but married his mother. This comparison, which will please Shakespeare enthusiasts who can pat themselves on their back for recognising the reference to a different Shakespeare play, makes it seem ridiculous that folk are brandishing swords and ludicrous taunts over nothing more than an airy word. The effect of reading rewrites of famous texts can be a reassessment, therefore, of the original text itself, and lines such as these can make the audience reconsider the tragedy of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. For if the Capulet-Montagu feud is as pathetically pointless as drummed in by lyrics such as "the basis of our quarrel has been totally forgotten," then the deaths that occur in the play are even more tragic. Irrespective of the cause of the conflict, the consequences of the Capulet-Montagu dispute spread far and wide. It is not only servants who partake in bloody fighting, but respectable citizens from other families as well. During his furious speech, the prince reveals that their civil brawls have made Verona's ancient citizens cast by their grave beseeming ornaments to wield old partisans in hands as old, cankered with peace, to part your cankered hate. And so the dignified elder statesmen of Verona have been forced into the melee, compelled into exchanging staffs for old weapons, just to try to stop the two families' public fighting. Luhrmann graphically and brilliantly shows how the Capulet-Montagu conflict has pervaded and infected the spirit of the entire city of Verona. Smoke billows from the fires started at the petrol station. A helicopter hovers between the Capulet and Montagu tower blocks, and a TV news reporter shows live pictures of the drama. Indeed, in yet another clever touch by Luhrmann, Capulet finds out about the latest dispute from the TV news report, which emphasises his own lack of control, even as the head of his family, over a conflict which can erupt at any point, be triggered by a number of different people and sources, and spread rapidly across his home city. So young men in Shakespeare and Baz Luhrmann treat the Capulet-Montagu conflict with the utmost seriousness, and the effect is violence. Rosario, in Love Is All There Is, has a far more laid-back approach to his family's rivalry with the Malachichis. Due to play Romeo in a local production, following his previous success the other year as Pinocchio, he finds out that the last-minute replacement will be Gina Malachichi. Here's his reaction.
I just heard about the Malachichi girl. Pop, could you imagine them asking me to play Romeo opposite the daughter of that Florentine Struns? Every bone in my body tells me I should quit right now. Forget about it.
Oh, honey, if you feel like that.
But the show must go on. Mr. Luca wants me to go introduce myself before rehearsal.
Although at first he plays lip service to a supposedly bitter rivalry with comments such as "every bone in my body tells me I should quit right now," and in doing so shows himself respectful towards his parents' views. The rapidity with which he then goes on to vow that the show must go on and discuss the practical arrangements of meeting his new co-star imply that his professionalism, his enjoyment of acting, and the prospect of meeting a new possibly attractive girl who, lest we forget, he will need to kiss on stage and aim loving words towards, far outweigh concerns about the Malachichi-Capomezzo conflict. Whereas in Shakespeare, the conflict between the two houses seems to help decide all key decisions, from who to invite to a party to who should be given special permission to woo a family member. In Love Is All There is a much greater sense of proportion. After all, if you had spent tens and tens of hours learning Romeo's lines and invested a degree of emotional energy in the role, you would surely want to go ahead with the performance, even if it was with an unknown daughter of someone your parents hated or were competing against in business. In Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, the prince makes the consequences of the Capulets and Montagus continuing their conflict violently and in public abundantly clear: death. Lord Capulet, in conversation with Paris, suggests that it should be relatively easy for both himself and Montagu, men so old as we, to keep the peace. However, as a reference to age indirectly implies, restraining younger members involved in the disputes may be more problematic, and so it proves during the Capulet ball in Act 1, Scene 5. Tibal has recognised Romeo and is furious that a Montagu has sneaked into their house. He roars, "What? Dares the slave come hither, covered with an antic face, to fleer and scorn at our solemnity? Now by the stock and honour of my kin, to strike him dead, I hold it not a sin." Tybalt's words show his utter hatred and disdain for Romeo purely because he is a Montagu. Calling him a slave, a villain, is still a terrible insult, but would have been even more so in Shakespeare's time, due to a greater consciousness and regard for social class. His concluding rhyming couplet indicates his belief that behaviour on the part of a Montagu that implies gross disrespect to a Capulet gives himself the right to take the law into his own hands and commit murder. So what is Romeo actually doing at this point? Well, he has sneaked into a party uninvited and is currently eyeing up a teenage girl, Juliet. He hasn't touched anyone, hasn't slagged off anyone, and hasn't shown any inclination for violence or disrespect whatsoever. Now, the stage directions don't make it clear as to whether Tybalt realises that Romeo's gushing imagery is targeted at Juliet. If he does, then as a protective male relative within a patriarchal society, he possibly does have the right to be annoyed and dish out stern words. But either way, the idea that he should be able to slaughter Romeo and thereafter absolve himself from religious punishment is nonsensical and totally out of proportion. Lord Capulet may feel that it should be straightforward to restrain the furious impulses prompted by their ancient conflict with the Montagues, but the violent irrationality and ludicrous sense of self-justification implied within his nephew's words suggest that it would take more than dire warnings of death or feeble older generation diktats to control the behaviour of younger household members. Capulet rebukes Tybalt and refuses to let him confront Romeo, who he proportionally describes as being reputed as being a virtuous and well-governed youth. This successfully prevents a potential fourth civil brawl and a mutiny amongst his guests. Nonetheless, it has clearly not satiated his nephew, who delivers a soliloquy vowing bitterest revenge at a later point. Baz Luhrmann includes this vengeful vow in his movie, yet shifts its position to the end of the party and scene, rather than following Capulet dressing down. Let's take a look.
My only love sprung from my only hate. Too early seen unknown and know too late. Prodigious birth of love it is to me that I must love a loathed enemy.
I will withdraw, but this intrusion shall, now seeming sweet, convert to bitter as gall.
The effect of this change is striking. In Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet have not yet met and exchanged their loving sonnet when Tybalt reveals he is prepared to wait to get his revenge on the former. However, in Luhrmann, Romeo and Juliet have already met, kissed, ascertained that their respective identities, and realise that they have fallen unescapably in love with each other. When Juliet says, "Prodigious birth of love it is to me that I must love a loathed enemy," in Luhrmann's movie, the presence of Tybalt snarling and smoking for Romeo's blood immediately after this tragic declaration of love hammers home to the viewer just how deadly the existence of the Montague-Capulet conflict is likely to prove to any future relationship. By contrast, in Shakespeare, Tybalt has left the stage and been half forgotten. This allows the audience to focus on Romeo and Juliet's burgeoning relationship, to enjoy their loving, intuitive poetry. And even when they find out their identities, the sense that their love is doomed is softened by the fact the danger is non-specific. When Juliet cries, "My only love sprung from my only hate," the antithesis of love and hate prompts the audience to wallow poetically in the potentially tragic consequences, but there is no sense of immediate danger. In Baz Luhrmann's version, the danger is self-evident and very real. Tybalt is there, has been lurking in the background, and is ready to act. In The People vs. Friar Laurence, the man who killed Romeo and Juliet, Swan and West send up Tybalt's irrationally bloodthirsty hatred of Romeo within a splendid ballad. Just as in Shakespeare, there is conflict between the older generation's preference to keep the peace and the younger's fury, but comic detail is given as to how Tybalt would like to strike Romeo dead.
I want to slay him, slice, dice, and fillet him, make the world forget he had a pretty face. Your rage is ludicrous, like Titus Andronicus. Yes, and a severed head would liven up this place.
The verbs slice, dice, and fillet are all associated with preparing animal meat for cooking, and the suggestion of cannibalism once again emphasises the hilarious disproportionality of Tybalt's anger in relation to a quarry, remember, whose basis has been totally forgotten. Additionally, Swan and West have Tybalt using cannibalistic verbs within a ballad, and the comic contrast between the catchy tune and the ferocious desire to kill in a particular way indicate to the audience that they don't need to take Tybalt's threats too seriously. Death will be a source of comedy rather than tragedy in this musical. Once again, Swan and West decide to include a reference to a different Shakespeare play within their lyrics, this time the blood-soaked Titus Andronicus. Capulet calls Tybalt's rage ludicrous, like Titus Andronicus, and certainly Titus's fury following the unfair execution of his sons Marcius and Quintus, and the savage rape and mutilation of his daughter Lavinia, results in a rapid escalation into a world of uncontrolled revenge, which culminates in the serving up of severed heads within a pie. However, this comparison is less apt, as at least Titus Andronicus had some excellent reasons to be angry, Tybalt much less so. The People versus Friar Laurence, the man who killed Romeo and Juliet, may largely follow the plot of Shakespeare's play, and include the conflict between the Capulets and Montagues. However, such a conflict is shown to be so ridiculous that it's comic. In Romeo and Juliet, Tybalt is true to his word, and in Act 3, Scene 1, challenges Romeo to a duel. Romeo, who has married Juliet in the previous scene, has no interest in fighting his new cousin-in-law, and issues this surprising response to Tybalt's testosterone-fueled imperative, turn and draw. I do protest I never injured thee, but love thee better than thou canst devise. And so, good Capulet, which name I tender as dearly as mine own, be satisfied. The request for Tybalt to be satisfied echoes Romeo's plaintive question to Juliet in Act 2, Scene 2, following their open declaration of love, and accentuates the malignant link between Tybalt and Romeo and Juliet's budding relationship. However, notably, Tybalt does not immediately respond to Romeo's words of love. Possibly he's been stunned into temporary silence by their conciliatory tone, and instead it is Mercutio, Romeo's best friend, who pipes up. He condemns Romeo's gentle, effeminate response by crying, "Oh, calm, dishonourable, vile submission! Alla staccata carries it away. Tybalt, you rat-catcher, will you walk?" Mercutio's words indicate how the feverish, aggression-fueled atmosphere of the Montague-Capulet conflict has spread to and infected friends and family members. Romeo's attempts at peacekeeping are dismissed as dishonourable and vile and unbefitting a noble member of the Montague clan, so much so that Mercutio decides to intervene on his friend's behalf, which he does with a challenge to fight contained within the fencing term alla staccata, meaning at the thrust. Mercutio, of course, is killed during the subsequent melee, and his death highlights the disproportionate violence of the Capulet-Montague conflict. Mercutio is fighting in place of his best friend Romeo, and the reason Tybalt wanted to fight Romeo was triggered merely because he had gate-crashed a family gathering, albeit one labelled as an old accustomed feast. Incredible! The fact Mercutio's death is ultimately caused by something apparently so insignificant highlights the combustibility of the Capulet-Montague conflict. Very little is needed to reignite the feud. Throughout The People versus Friar Laurence, the man who killed Romeo and Juliet, Swan and West continue to satirise the inherent violence within Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. In the equivalent section of the musical, Tybalt and Mercutio sing together of their desire to kill each other, comically ending with the beseeching "Pretty please."
Accept my apology. I love you, don't kill me. Besides the prince, outlawed belligerents.
Romeo, love has made you weak. I can see your coward streak. It is time that we fulfill our destinies. Just let me kill him, pretty please.
In this extract, Tybalt makes reference to fulfilling our destinies, and Swan and West have drawn the idea of predestination from other sections of Shakespeare's play, most notably Romeo's fears before the Capulet party, Juliet's comments about her future should the dashing young man she has kissed be married, and Romeo's reaction after killing Tybalt. However, in Shakespeare's original play, Tybalt is far too caught up with hatred and the desire for violence against a Montague to be reflective enough to make any comments about whether he as a human being may be being ultimately controlled by a more powerful source. Indeed, one senses that Shakespeare's Tibal would have considered such thoughts unmanly and dishonourable, as detracting from his own dignity as a Capulet and self-generated strength as a lusty young man. Nonetheless, in The People versus Friar Laurence, the man who killed Romeo and Juliet, a Tibal who adds the alliterative, squawking, parrot-esque tag on "pretty please" to a tuneful plea to kill can only be viewed comically, and by extension, the conflict between the families which he represents so vigorously. In Baz Luhrmann's version of Romeo and Juliet, there is a real sense of the tragic consequences of the Montague-Capulet conflict. Let's watch as Mercutio, played by Harold Perrineau, takes his final breaths.
Plague for both your houses.
No! No!
Following Romeo's anguished cries of "No, no!", the camera pans to an extreme long shot, which shows the dark storm clouds thundering above, palm trees swirling violently in the wind, building site rubble, and what looks like the back of a temporarily erected stage. The human beings look tiny through the stage opening, and combined with the foreboding flashes of lightning and tragic choral singing, the viewer gets a sense of the insignificance and comparative powerlessness of human beings when faced with nature and arguably fate. Moments later, the camera returns to a close-up of Romeo cradling Mercutio. The choral voices now sing Requiem Aeternam, a plea for eternal rest. Children watch on, sombre-faced, innocence destroyed. The inescapable conclusion for the viewer is that Mercutio's death, caused by the bread of an airy word conflict between the Montagues and the Capulets, has removed Romeo's control over his actions, and that his previously remarkably restrained behaviour towards his family's bitter enemy must immediately be consigned to the past. The thundery weather reflects Romeo's emotions precisely, Luhrmann's deliberate use of pathetic fallacy, and he must now storm his way towards further tragic violence and confrontation. Death is caused by family conflict also appears within the Bologna and Taylor's Love Is All There Is, but it appears during a play within a film production of Romeo and Juliet. Rosario, playing Romeo, delivers his character's famous last line before giving his apparently dead wife a kiss to remember. Have a look.
Thus, with a kiss, I die.
They're doing it for real. Yes.
Rosario! Rosario! No more! Stop!
How dare he do that to my little girl?
You pretend to be Mama's boy. All the Sicilian trick in the back of the book.
But why she don't stop him? Tell me why.
Because she has to act as if she's dead. And he's taking advantage.
Rosario's passionate snogging and exploratory hand highlights the artificiality of his theatrical performance as Romeo and is a flagrant disregard for his own family's family conflict, given that the actress playing Juliet is a Malachichi, a deadly business rival to his own family's business. The snogging goes on and on. The audience gleefully gawp at the two passionate youngsters, for Gina as Juliet is most certainly reciprocating, whilst the Malachichis look on horrified. The effect of the kissing is to pull the audience away from the tragic story of Romeo and Juliet, caused of course largely by the conflict between the tragic heroes' respective families, and instead towards the actors playing the main parts, whose own families are apparently in such deadly dispute with each other. Given that the kissing is so public and so brazen, and theatrical convention means that audience members cannot interrupt events on stage, even to protect their son or daughter's honour, the result is a clear victory for the younger generation's carefree, passionate impulses over the older generation's narrow-minded outlook and bickering. In Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, the younger generation's youthful passion most certainly does not triumph over their parents' hatred, and a significant reason for this is the death of Tybalt. As previously mentioned, Mercutio's death creates an intense, irrepressible reaction in Romeo and triggers a ferocious desire for revenge. With Mercutio confirmed dead and his killer Tybalt inexplicably and dramatically conveniently re-entering the stage, Romeo cries out, "Alive, in triumph, and Mercutio slain, away to heaven respective lenity, and fire-eyed fury be my conduct now." The opening short sentences and exclamation marks highlights Romeo's outrage at the contrasting statuses of his good friend and his enemy, whilst positioning the alliterative fire-eyed fury at the beginning of the final main clause shows how he has willfully abdicated responsibility for his subsequent actions. The consequences of Romeo's appearance at the Capulet ball, and remember he only went in the hope of getting an eyeful of Rosaline, have spiralled in a way he could never have predicted. Love, but not with Rosaline, and an intensification of his family conflict, resulting in the deaths of two people from either side in the process. From being an outsider to conflict in Act 1, Scene 1, Romeo has become the central figure, the catalyst to Mercutio's death, and a Capulet killer himself. Such a man is unlikely to be welcomed into the Capulet clan with open arms. Earlier I discussed how Baz Luhrmann repositioned Tybalt's vengeful soliloquy at the Capulet ball, and he moved it to the end of the scene, in order to accentuate the tragic destructive link between Romeo and Juliet's relationship and Tybalt. The same strategy is employed when Luhrmann sandwiches some of Juliet's loving reflections from Act 3, Scene 2 between the deaths of Mercutio and Tybalt. Have a look at this.
Oh, I have bought the mansion of a love but not possessed it, and though I am sold, not yet enjoyed. Oh, tedious is this day, as is the night before some festival to an impatient child that hath new robes and may not wear them.
The entire extract from Juliet's soliloquy focuses on her eager anticipation to sexually consummate her relationship with Romeo. When Juliet dreamily muses she has bought the mansion of her love, she is saying she now has the ultimate framework for her feelings, being married. However, she hasn't yet possessed this mansion, hasn't yet been inside and explored the exciting novelty of sanctioned sex, something she is desperate to do. She is like an impatient child that has new robes and may not wear them, with the new robes likewise representing her changed status as a married woman. Yet she hasn't been able to fully experience the rights granted to her as a married woman, i.e. sexual consummation. In Shakespeare's original text, these lines are immediately followed by the entrance of the nurse, who is quick to melodramatically and unhelpfully holler, "He's dead, he's dead, he's dead!" With no names specified, Juliet obviously assumes that Romeo himself has died, which the audience knows via dramatic irony is false. Tension builds as we wait to see Juliet's reaction to finding out her husband may be alive but has committed murder. And crucially, there is a clear distance between the chaotic, vengeful violence of the Mercutio-Tybalt-Romeo axis and Juliet's bedroom, both in time span and the fact Juliet finds out what has happened second-hand via the nurse. In Luhrmann, seconds after Juliet smiling, flopping around on her bed and contemplating gentle lovemaking, we have a terrifying close-up of Romeo's blood-stained face screaming as his fire-eyed fury yanks down the acceleration pedal and speeds towards what would be a fatal final confrontation with Tybalt. The effect of Luhrmann juxtaposing these utterly contrasting feelings and moments is to emphasise the deeply uncomfortable relationship between sex and violence, which was seen overtly in the opening scene and has remained beneath the surface ever since. Of course, in Shakespeare, the older generation remain largely ignorant of both the younger ones fighting and their lovemaking until it is far too late. Capulet's failure to control his nephew Tybalt outside the grounds of his house leads to the latter's and Mercutio's deaths, whilst their ignorance of Romeo and Juliet's relationship and marriage results in not only a calamitously relentless pursuit of a Paris-Juliet match, but Juliet electing to follow a ham-fisted plan to fake death, which all too predictably ends in disaster. By contrast, in Love Is All There Is, the older generation are aware of each stage of Rosario and Gina's relationship, which not only prevents the need for overcomplicated deceit, but also results in comedy, as the audience watch the parents powerlessly trying to prevent their children developing a relationship. This is seen superbly at the end of the production of Romeo and Juliet in the film, when the Capomezza and Malachichi families have sprinted towards the wings of the stage, ready to split up their respective son and daughter. The result is a hilarious unseemly squabble with their offspring in front of the entire theatre audience.
For never was a story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo.
Come on, Rosario, you gotta help with us, folks. Get out of here. Jesus. Say, come on. Let's get off the stage. Get off.
I was so disgusted over how you kissed that boy. It was pornografia.
All right. Tonight we go home, sleep the night good. Tomorrow you are in Paris, we forget about everything.
Oh, no, Papa, the banquet, huh? The whole cast is going.
No, I would not set foot in that Campamessa Capering Hall for 1 moment. And neither should you.
And that is final.
It is the parents who look most foolish for sprinting onto stage, blocking the bows of the performers, most certainly not alike in dignity as initially described in Shakespeare. And the Malachichi's subsequent exchange with Gina is more notable for their comic faux Italian mangling of the English language with non-words such as pornografia than any genuine authority. The Capomezza-Malachichi conflict results in the respective parents repeatedly losing their dignity in their desperation to separate their offspring, and it is shown once again to be a delicious source of comedy. In Love Is All There Is, the elder Capomezzas and Malachichis may be desperate for Rosario and Gina not to get together, but unlike in Shakespeare, at least they don't have anyone else in mind. In Romeo and Juliet, following the drama of the deaths of Mercutio and Tybalt, Romeo's banishment and last-minute consummation with Juliet, Capulet bursts into his daughter's chambers and issues her with a decree to marry Paris. Of course, Juliet can't, and her refusal results in shocking tirades of abuse and disownment. In one particularly violent outburst, he cries, "And you be mine, I'll give you to my friends, and you be not, hang, beg, starve, die in the streets, for by my soul I'll ne'er acknowledge this, nor what is mine shall never do thee good." What is most striking here is Capulet's language of possession and his terrifyingly black and white either-or reaction to Juliet's reluctance to marry in a few days' time. Rather than describe her as his daughter, Juliet is simply mine, a word he repeats later on when referring presumably to his own possessions, wisdom and wealth, which she would expect to share in as his only child. Capulet's language denies Juliet a separate identity of her own, bars her an individual autonomy as a human being, whilst the fact he repeats the word mine when threatening not to allow her to benefit from what is mine implies that he views wife, daughter, house, money, possessions, all and one the same, things which he is entitled to have complete control over. And so Juliet's wedding, conducted in secret due to the ancient conflict between the Capulet and the Montagues, combined with her father's haste to marry her to Paris, result in an inner family conflict which seems impossible to resolve without violent or tragic consequences. This conflict is intensified by Capulet's rigidity of character, compromise as anathema, stemming presumably partly from his own nature, but also from the powers and privileges piled onto men within patriarchal Elizabethan society. Just as Baz Luhrmann cuts much of the potentially mystifying sexualised banter from Act 1, Scene 1 of the play and replaces it with nipple-licking, thrusting and schoolgirls in a minibus, so here some of Capulet's lines are likewise cut. However, given that the film genre allows for much greater realism when it comes to fighting and aggression, camera angles, the potential for multiple retakes, dramatic music and sound effects can all be utilised for maximum effect, the viewer is equally left in no doubt that Capulet cannot and will not tolerate insubordination from anyone, least of all someone who is merely mine.
you mumbling fool! I tell you what, get thee to church Thursday, or never after look me in the face, and you be mine. I give you to my friend, and you be not hang, beg, starve, die in the streets. Just do it. Bethink you, I'll not be persuaded.
Capulet physically yanks Juliet onto the hallway in his rage, and when his wife attempts to restrain him by pulling on his shoulder and crying, "Are you mad?" she is rewarded with some kind of slap or punch heard by the viewer, but which takes place just out of the sight of the shaky camera, and this technique contributes towards a sense of instability appropriate for such a violent scene. Juliet is physically shaken during the cursed imperatives, "Hang thee, young baggage," and when the nurse tries to intervene, Capulet moves his head aggressively in her direction, possibly even to spit. The background music of tragic clashing strings accentuates the apparently impassable conflict between father and daughter, and shifts the viewer a step closer towards the tragic inevitability of further deaths. In The People vs. Friar Laurence, the man who killed Romeo and Juliet, Swan and West explore Capulet's motives for wanting Juliet to marry Paris so quickly, more specifically. Whereas in Shakespeare's original, Paris is Capulet's friend and a respectful noble earl, in this irreverent but fun musical, he is a rich bachelor whom Capulet wants to keep on side for business reasons. In scene 48, Capulet firstly, and quite rightly, refuses Paris's request to marry his daughter so quickly. He says, "Marry my daughter on Thursday? That's way too soon." Paris responds with this threat, "Unless I marry Juliet this week, I will sell my vineyard to Lord Pritzker," resulting in a comically immediate change of tack on Capulet's part. Thursday it is. The stage directions indicate that Lord Pritzker can be substituted for a local or newsworthy wealthy man, and so Juliet's fate is sealed by her father treating her cynically as a pawn to consolidate his own business interests. The abruptness of his about turn and the brevity of Thursday it is comic and paints a world in which the characters themselves are shallow parodies of Shakespeare's original, meaning that the ensuing conflict between father and daughter is a scene of light-hearted laughter rather than life or death melodrama. The timing of Capulet's decree that Juliet must marry Paris adds particular dramatic tension in Romeo and Juliet. It occurs in the very same scene in which Romeo and Juliet wake up together, having consummated their relationship. The fact that Capulets are not aware of this results in dramatic irony and the creation of a situation which seems impossible to resolve. Juliet cannot admit she is married to Romeo, yet she must marry Paris the very same week. In Love Is All There Is, both families find out immediately about their children consummating their relationship rather than their marriage, and so the conflict arises from their despair and fury at this sexual naughtiness, rather than because one of the children is refusing to marry someone else. With both couples gathered at the lower class Capomezza household, the Malachicci show their anger at their daughter's behaviour and how it has influenced her views of her medium-term future.
Yeah, and now she don't want to go to Paris no more or be a ballet dancer anymore.
Santa Rodolfo, Madre de Dio! Have you lost your mind? You'll throw away your life for this? You're getting on that plane if I have to drag you by the hair!
You're making Gina cry. She wants to be with me. Is that such a bad thing?
I'm going to kill you, that's
Let go of him! Hey, get back in that chair! You want to scream and yell like your wife, you got every right, but you try to choke my son again, I'll throw you in the bay!
In a clever twist on the name of Shakespeare's doomed never to become husband to Juliet, Paris is a destination rather than a person, and it is left to the more easygoing Mama Capomezza to break the news to her female counterpart that Gina no longer wants to go to Paris no more and be a ballet dancer anymore due to her suddenly acquired intense feelings for Rosario. Bologna Taylor uses the transformation of Paris into a destination to reflect the very different values and attitudes of late 20th century society compared with Shakespeare's day. Love Is All There Is set in the Bronx in New York City in the 1990s, and unlike in Shakespeare's day, opportunities for women extend far beyond the narrow realms of wedlock, meaning ambitious parents are far more likely to push a daughter into furthering her education or career rather than into an early marriage. And so the Countess of Malachichi is appalled that her daughter appears to be throwing away a glittering opportunity to embark upon the first steps of a career as a ballet dancer in Paris by cavorting amorously with someone she would dismiss as a scruffy, social inferior no-hoper. For unlike in Shakespeare, conflict between generations emerges from an arguably feminist desire for a young woman to sow the seeds for a successful career before settling down, which is pitted against the individual's own desire to make her own decisions, including those relating to love. Either way, in all texts, Paris is not something Juliet is prepared to countenance, and this results in clashes between the generations. Of course, the confrontation in Love Is All There Is typically comic, in spite of Bologna's tailor approximate paraphrasing of one of Capulet's most aggressive lines. Following Rosario's gentle remonstrance that Gina simply wants to be with him, the Count of Malachichi leaps up, and the ensuing scuffle is pure farce, with a tracksuited Papa Capomezza pulling his business arrival away from his son, amidst hilarious faux Italian cries of but I love him from Gina. It is also noticeable that the quasi-aggressive behaviour of the Count of Malachichi towards Rosario results in Papa Capomezza instinctively coming to his son's aid, and the pair putting their intra-family conflict temporarily aside to present a united front. Ancient conflict between the Capulet and Montague households certainly results in the deaths of Tibal and Mercutio. However, the deaths of Romeo and Juliet cannot be attributed solely to this source. Yes, the conflict between their families means the love-struck teenagers marry without their parents' knowledge or consent, but they could hardly have envisaged Lord Capulet's decree that Juliet must marry Paris later that very same week. As a result, in Act 4, Scene 1, Juliet agrees to an elaborate plan hatched by Friar Laurence, which will see her swallow a potion, which will result in her adapting the borrowed likeness of shrunk death for 42 hours. This part of the plan works perfectly, but the fact Romeo doesn't receive Friar Laurence's letters explaining the plan results in disaster. He kills himself by what he thinks is Juliet's dead body, but is merely her borrowed likeness of shrunk death. So it is family conflict combined with Elizabethan patriarchal whimsy and failure to communicate which leads to such tragic scenes at the end of Romeo and Juliet. In Act 5, Scene 2, Friar John explains to an increasingly frantic Friar Laurence that he wasn't able to deliver his letter to Romeo. Here in the city, visiting the sick and finding him, the searchers of the town, suspecting that we both were in a house where the infectious pestilence did reign, sealed up the doors and would not let us forth, so that my speed to Mantua here was stayed. The irony here is that by doing good, caring and praying for sick people, Friar John has unwittingly facilitated the death of others. Searchers of the town refers to city health inspectors, whilst the infectious pestilence is the plague. Just as a British man who caught the Ebola virus in Sierra Leone in August 2014 was placed in an isolation unit at the Royal Free Hospital in London, so Friar John was quarantined in an attempt to stop any potential disease spreading to others. This is all very reasonable and prudent. Yet hours later, it results in someone with no connection to either Friar John or the plague killing himself in a paroxysm of despair. Shakespeare shows the interrelated web of human existence and how apparently trivial details could assume a significance that we as human beings would never have envisaged. In Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, Friar John's failure to deliver the letter is due to a benign desire to do good. Less so in The People vs. Friar Laurence, the man who killed Romeo and Juliet. Yes, Friar John is similarly restricted in his movements, like his Shakespearean equivalent, but comically, considering his status as a priest, he is more interested in his own carnal desires than either doing good or delivering a life or death message. Swan and West played with the idea of priestly authority in the invention of a police-esque clergy badge, whilst the idea that this was taken off to show to a nun just to impress her breaks so many spoken and unspoken rules of being a priest, You should abstain from sexual relationships and from pursuing the like through flirting. You should show humility. That it results in further humour for the audience. Indeed, a persistent source of humour for the audience watching The People versus Friar Laurence, the man who killed Romeo and Juliet, is the conflict or contrast between how we might expect characters inspired by Shakespeare's tragedy to act and the stage reality. And so Romeo and Juliet initially elect to use each other tonight. The former tells the latter to rein in the poetry. And here Friar John shows a brazen preference to making the very most of any benefits that may come with his chosen holy profession. Baz Luhrmann's William Shakespeare's Romeo plus Juliet, the plus between Romeo and Juliet resembles a square cross, is set in a futuristic urban backdrop of Verona Beach, as opposed to an Elizabethan England which experienced terrifying outbreaks of plague between 1596 and 1599 and 1602 and 1611. Luhrmann therefore modernises Shakespeare's explanation for Friar John's failure to deliver the letter by replacing "we both were in a house where the infectious pestilence did reign" with a "sorry you were out" postal company note.
I'll send my letters to thy lord post haste, Mantua.
The explanations may be different, but as in Shakespeare's original, we are left with the same sense that the key players in the tragedy, Romeo, Juliet, and to a lesser extent Friar Laurence, have found that events have conspired to spiral out of their control in spite of elaborately laid plans. In Love Is All There Is, knowledge of their children's feelings and relationship initially intensifies the conflict between the Capomezzes and the Malachiccis. However, when the parents discover that their children may be in grave danger, they are able to set aside their differences whilst they are still alive, unlike, tragically, in Shakespeare's original. With the four of them squeezed into a car, frantically driving around looking for Gina and Rosario, they vow to end their bitter rivalry if they find their children alive.
I promise, if the children are all right, we will divide the neighborhood in equal part. I will go after only the upper echelon, and you will go after the people of your level.
You're a real fair guy for a big snob.
I thank you very much.
As ever, Bologna Taylor combines melodrama with humour, something Shakespeare rarely does in his tragedies, with a possible exception of the black humour contained within Mercutio's famous line, "Ask for me tomorrow and you shall find me a grave man." The Countess of Malachicci may be in tears, her husband's voice cracking with emotion, but we can't help but laugh at the transparent, unpolitically correct snobbery revealed within lines such as, "I would go after only the upper echelon and you would go after the people of your level." Indeed, whereas in Shakespeare there is a sense of the futility of two families so similar, so alike in dignity, constantly warring with each other, in Love Is All There Is, the directors use the differences between the families as a source of delicious contrast. And so the real tragedy of Romeo and Juliet is that, unlike in Love Is All There Is, the conflict between the two families is not resolved in the young person's lifetimes. Yes, the Capulets and Montagues are finally united, but only after their children have died, largely as a result of their bitter family rivalries. In the closing lines of Act 5, Scene 3, there is a sense of terrible waste as Capulet finally says, "O brother Montague, give me thy hand. This is my father's jointure, for no more can I demand." Jointure refers to a marriage settlement, and so the implication is that the two families will now put their differences aside as a limp token gesture following the deaths of their children. It is of course something, but doesn't remove the burning sense of pointless lots, which is a Shakespeare's tragedy's typical legacy. Luhrmann cuts this line and instead brutally emphasises what the ultimate consequences of the Capulet-Montague conflict have been by showing Romeo and Juliet's body bags being lifted into an ambulance as their fathers look on.
Punishing!
A glooming peace this
morning with it brings. The sun for sorrow will not show his head. Go hence to have more talk of these sad things. Some shall be pardoned, and some punished. For never was a story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo.
The two fathers look shattered as the prince shouts about everyone being punished, and the additional third syllable gives appropriate formality and resonance to his words. But Luhrmann chooses not to include Shakespeare's reconciliation, although at least the men now seem to be able to stand within a few feet of each other. Death caused by conflict, patriarchal pressure and simple bad luck continues to be a far less serious matter in The People vs. Friar Laurence, the man who killed Romeo and Juliet. In scene 69, both Romeo and Juliet die, but they ludicrously compete for the privilege of dying last, and therefore upstaging the other, by constantly reviving after having apparently taken their final breaths.
This is a dagger that I see before me. Like a bull's horn, I bet it's to adore me. Yes, I am a drama queen, exiting my big scene. Thank you for dying first.
Giving me this dope is so like smoking oregano. Thank you for dying first. Go.
Jesus, that really smarts, but somehow it missed my heart. Thank you for dying first.
Once again, we have the reference to a different Shakespeare play, this time Macbeth, and this combined with the open admission from Juliet that she is a drama queen exiting my big scene, emphasises the artificiality of the theatrical experience, even one as potentially powerful as Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. On one level, what we are watching represents a potential reality, but beneath this lie ordinary human beings, actors, with their respective egos and rivalries. By drawing attention to this explicitly, Swan and West is once again producing humour in the conflict between what we might expect in a play inspired by Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, a highly emotional final scene caused by the tragic deaths of two lovers, and what we actually see, two actors being silly and deliberately making the deaths of their two characters as preposterous and unrealistic as possible. In Love Is All There Is, with Gina and Rosario safely found, their respective parents are as good as their word, and the end of their conflict is symbolised with the pair's marriage at the end of the film. Their speeches, which bizarrely take place during the ceremony in church, show how past conflict has morphed into compromise. Both Rosario and Gina show their respect for their parents by partially and publicly agreeing to follow paths that their parents approve of.
I'd like to thank my parents for making it possible for me to go to Paris with Gina for 4 years to study acting at the Comédie Française during the day and Cordon Bleu for cooking at night.
And my parents for allowing me to study ballet and archaeology, and for supporting me in Rosario while we find ourselves.
As a member of a family running a catering business, Rosario pleases his parents by proposing to study at a Cordon Bleu for cooking at night, whilst Gina will study ballet in Paris after all, albeit with her own add-ons of archaeology and Rosario. So the four texts differ in their treatment of the theme of conflict. Both Shakespeare's original text and Luhrmann's movie highlight the unforeseen, potentially tragic consequences of both family and intragenerational conflicts. The People vs. Friar Laurence, the man who killed Romeo and Juliet, satirises the reasons and origins of the Capulet-Montague conflict, and the consequences are so self-consciously theatrical and contrary to what we would expect from a Romeo and Juliet based text that we can't help but laugh. And in Love Is All There Is, the public nature of Gina and Rosario's relationship results in comic public confrontations between their families, which ends for good when they realise the lives of their children may be in danger. For, as in The People vs. Friar Laurence, the man who killed Romeo and Juliet emphasises so brilliantly, no conflict or dispute or argument can be worth pursuing if it ultimately results in death. This has been a Schofield on Shakespeare production exploring the theme of conflict in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, Baz Luhrmann's movie version, the musical The People vs Friar Laurence, The Man Who Killed Romeo and Juliet, and Bologna Taylor's Love Is All There Is. Thanks for watching.